Starting over in a big city like New York was never going to be easy, but nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. When I finally arrived at my new apartment, the sky was covered in gray clouds, and a cold wind blew relentlessly. The building, old and imposing, had a nostalgic charm with its stained glass windows and worn walls. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as I climbed the narrow stairs, carrying the last of my moving boxes. Little did I know that this place would soon become the setting for a series of unsettling events. As I entered the apartment, I was greeted by Ben, my new roommate, who seemed like a friendly and welcoming guy. He greeted me with a smile and a firm handshake, mentioning how excited he was to share the space with me. Ben showed me the kitchen, the bathroom, and my room as we chatted about common interests and our daily routines. Everything seemed normal, and I was eager to start this new chapter of my life. However, it didn't take long for me to realize there was something peculiar about Ben, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. That first night, as I settled in, an unsettling silence hung in the air. The sound of Ben's footsteps in the hallway echoed softly through the thin walls of the apartment. Lying in bed, the streetlight filtered through the curtains, creating dancing shadows on the ceiling. I closed my eyes, but the feeling of discomfort kept me from falling asleep. Something was off, and a part of me already knew it, but I ignored it, trying to convince myself it was just the nerves of moving. The next morning, sunlight flooded the apartment, bringing a sense of renewal and hope. I had breakfast with Ben, who seemed completely normal, chatting about our plans for the day. Despite the unease of the previous night, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Yet, when he left for work, something in his expression made me hesitate. His smile didn't reach his eyes, as if there was a hidden secret behind that friendly facade. That night, as I prepared for bed, a sense of discomfort washed over me again. Thoughts about life in the city began to fade when I heard murmurs coming from Ben's room. It wasn't the sound of a TV or quiet music, but rather a whisper, as if he were talking to someone. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart started to race. Something was definitely wrong, but I had no idea what was coming. The next morning over breakfast, I tried to ignore the persistent chill I felt. Ben was calm and serene, as if nothing had happened the night before. We talked about our daily routines, and he seemed as normal as any other roommate. Still, the memory of the whispers haunted me, and my mind couldn't shake that unsettling feeling. I decided that I needed to know more about him and what was happening in that locked room. Over the next few weeks, the whispers became a regular occurrence. Every night, around the same time, I would hear Ben talking quietly, as if conversing with someone invisible. I used to put on headphones to try to block it out, but curiosity wouldn't leave me alone. During the day, I observed Ben more closely, trying to catch any signs of strange behavior. He continued to act friendly, but I started noticing small peculiarities that made me suspicious. Ben had a habit of going out at odd hours, always carrying a backpack with him. Sometimes he would disappear for hours and return with a distant expression. I tried to get him to go out for a drink or dinner, but he always had an excuse ready. His life outside the apartment seemed shrouded in mystery, and more I wondered who he was really talking to at night. Something inside me told me I needed to find out the truth, but I didn't know where to start. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to explore the apartment a bit more while Ben was out. I opened drawers, checked the shared bathroom, and even looked through the kitchen for clues. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but when I entered the hallway leading to his room, I felt a palpable tension in the air. I tried the door, but it was locked, as always. As I stared at the doorknob, an idea began to form in my mind. Maybe if I could get into his room, I could discover what was really going on. That night, the whispers began again, and I was determined to unravel the mystery. I sat on my bed, trying to catch every word Ben was saying. Although I couldn't make out everything, a few words stood out. Control, potential, and he doesn't know. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized it was time to confront Ben about what was happening. I didn't know what I would find on the other side of that locked door, but I knew I had to find out. The next day, I woke up with a strange feeling. The whispers from the night before still echoed in my mind, but now there was something else. The determination to uncover the truth. Over breakfast, Ben was unusually quiet, as if something was bothering him too. I tried to approach the subject cautiously, asking about his work and his nighttime outings. He responded evasively, avoiding eye contact. My heart began to race. I knew I was getting close to something. After Ben left, I decided it was time to act. I waited until he was out of sight, then walked through the apartment to the door of his room. I grabbed a hairpin I had left on the kitchen table and, with a bit of skill and luck, managed to unlock the door. My heart was racing as I slowly opened it. Inside, the room looked normal at first glance, but something told me there was more than met the eye. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of unease that put me on high alert. The first thing I noticed was a cabinet in the corner, locked with a sturdy padlock. I knew I needed to see what was inside. With a mix of anxiety and adrenaline, I began searching for a key. I rummaged through drawers and checked under the mattress, but found nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed a small key hanging discreetly on a hook behind a picture frame. My hands trembled as I grabbed it. I was one step away from uncovering the mystery that haunted my roommate. When I opened the cabinet, I was met with something that made me freeze. Inside were a series of photos of me, taken without my knowledge, and a spiral-bound notebook filled with meticulous notes. The photos were organized methodically, some with dates and others with handwritten words like potential and control. My heart sank as I read the notes, which detailed my daily movements and personal details Ben shouldn't have known. The obsession was clear and terrifying, and I realized I was dealing with something far more serious than I had imagined. At the back of the cabinet, I found one more thing, a disposable phone, the kind used to avoid being traced. This suggested that Ben might be communicating with someone outside. The discovery filled me with fear, but also with the urgent need to get out of there as quickly as possible. I closed the cabinet and left the room, locking the door again. I needed to think about my next move, but one thing was certain. I could no longer ignore the danger Ben represented. After the disturbing discovery, the apartment felt more threatening than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The photos, the notes, everything pointed to a frightening obsession. During the day, I avoided any unnecessary contact with Ben, fearing he might sense that I knew something. However, the tension was palpable, and every minute I spent near him heightened my discomfort. I needed to make a decision, and fast. I talked to Lindsay, my co-worker, in an attempt to relieve the pressure I was feeling. She noticed my unease and asked what was going on. Reluctantly, I told her part of the story, without mentioning the photos or the notebook. I explained that my roommate was acting strangely, and that I was worried. Lindsay advised me to be cautious and suggested that it might be better to find a new place to live. Her words made sense, but the thought of leaving without confronting Ben left me unsatisfied. The following days were a test of patience and nerves. Ben continued with his mysterious outings and nighttime whispers. I stayed up late, listening to every movement, waiting for the right moment to act. My mind was in a constant state of alert, and I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home. The tension between us was almost tangible, like a rope about to snap. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Finally, on a night when Ben left earlier than usual, I decided to act. I turned on the recorder on my phone and hid it in the hallway near his room. I needed evidence of what was happening, both for my safety and for a possible confrontation. I waited patiently for his return, with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts. The sense of imminent danger was suffocating, but it also drove me to keep going, to face whatever was coming. When Ben finally returned, he seemed different. There was something in his eyes that made me uneasy, as if he knew what I had done. I swallowed hard and tried to stay calm, but I knew I was about to face a challenge. The moment of truth was approaching quickly, and I needed to be ready. With the recorder on and my heart pounding, I prepared myself to find out just how deep this obsession went, and what his real intentions were. The tension in the apartment was unbearable when Ben walked in, and I knew I couldn't delay the confrontation any longer. With my heart racing, I decided to approach the subject as directly as possible. "Ben, can we talk?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me with a curious expression. The atmosphere was charged, and I knew that any word could trigger something unexpected. I decided not to waste time with preambles and went straight to the point. "I found something in your room. The photos, the notes. Can you explain what's going on?" My voice was firm, but inside I was trembling with nervousness. Ben stared at me, surprised, and said he had no idea what I was talking about. His reaction seemed genuine, which made me hesitate for a moment. Ben challenged me to show him what I had found, certain that it was all a misunderstanding. I led Ben to his room, my heart pounding as I opened the door. When we reached the cabinet, he unlocked it with the key still hanging on the hook. To my surprise and despair, everything I had found earlier was gone. The photos, the notes, and the disposable phone were no longer there. The cabinet was now organized with Ben's clothes and personal belongings. I was stunned. The feeling of being manipulated or having hallucinated was terrifying. Ben looked at me with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "See? There's nothing here. You must have been mistaken, or maybe you're just too stressed," he said, his voice cold and calculated. I felt isolated in my own perception, questioning the reality of the events I had witnessed. Ben closed the cabinet and left the room, muttering something about needing some time to calm down. The feeling of disorientation was overwhelming. I no longer knew whom or what to believe. As night fell, I lay awake in bed, my mind tormented by doubts and insecurities. Everything was different now. Reality seemed to be slipping through my fingers like sand. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, that the threat I felt was real, even if there was no physical proof of it. I needed to find a way to escape this nightmare before something even more terrible happened. The silence of the apartment was almost deafening, and I knew the night still held surprises for me. In the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start. I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized they were approaching my room. The faint streetlight streamed through the window, casting dancing shadows on the ceiling, and I held my breath, listening intently. The shadow of Ben's feet appeared under the door crack, motionless, as if waiting for me to make a move. My heart raced, and I knew I had to act quickly. Slowly I got out of bed, trying not to make any noise. My door was locked, but something told me that wouldn't be an obstacle for Ben. I walked toward the window, my only escape route in mind. I heard a distinct sound that made my blood run cold, a key being inserted into the lock, turning slowly. How did he have the key to my room? Terror gripped me, and I knew time was running out. The doorknob started to turn, and I opened the window with trembling hands, focused on reaching the fire escape. As the door began to open, I slipped out the window, feeling the cool early morning air against my face. I glanced back, only to see Ben's silhouette standing in the doorway, holding a clear plastic bag in his hands. The sight terrified me. He was ready to attack in a way I had never imagined. The bag, empty, hinted at a horrific fate I had narrowly avoided. I continued down the fire escape, every step driven by fear and adrenaline. The sounds of the nighttime city echoed around me as I descended, my heart still racing. I looked up one last time, seeing Ben standing at the window, his figure now just a dark shadow against the approaching morning light. I was free, but I knew I wasn't safe. I ran through the deserted streets, my heart still pounding, until I reached the nearest police station. Bursting in, I told my story to the officers, detailing every disturbing event and the threat that Ben represented. They listened attentively, and a team was immediately dispatched to the apartment. Later, I was informed that Ben was no longer there when they arrived, and the place was empty, with no evidence of what I had witnessed. When I arrived in the small town of Pineville, the sense of tranquility was palpable. The old Victorian house, my new residence, seemed to fit perfectly into the bucolic landscape of New England. As I parked, I looked at the time-worn walls and frosted glass windows, feeling a mix of curiosity and anticipation. The house exuded a nostalgic atmosphere, as if each room held stories from the past. I was eager to start this new chapter of my life and meet my roommate Zoe, who had described the house as a place full of personality. As I entered, the smell of aged wood enveloped me, and the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet felt like a subtle greeting. Zoe welcomed me warmly, her extroverted personality filling the empty space with energy. She was a bit eccentric, with a unique appearance that included colorful hair and a bohemian style. We settled in quickly, exchanging stories and laughter as we unpacked my things. However, I couldn't help but notice some peculiar details, like the strange objects decorating the living room, including a crystal pendulum and several colorful stones. On the first night, as I prepared for bed, I felt a slight unease. The house was silent, except for the distant sound of the wind rattling the windows. Lying in bed, I began to think about the house's history, imagining all the people who had lived there before me. My reflections were interrupted by a strange sound, almost like a whisper coming from upstairs. I froze, trying to decipher the noise, but it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I convinced myself it was just the house settling into the night's cold. Over the next few days, I tried to get used to the sounds the house made. I believed they were normal in a place as old as this. However, the presence of Zoe's mystical objects everywhere kept my curiosity alive. We got along well, and I was happy with my decision to share the space with her. Despite this, the feeling that something more was happening lingered, especially when I saw Zoe spending long hours in the attic. I wondered what she was doing up there. One afternoon I decided to explore the neighborhood and ended up meeting Emma, the friendly lady who lived next door. We talked about the town, and when I mentioned the house, her eyes lit up with a peculiar interest. She told me the house was known for its unique energies, a phrase that made me chuckle slightly. Emma seemed to know more than she was willing to share, and her words echoed in my mind as I returned home. A part of me began to wonder if there was something deeper in the history of that Victorian house. After a few days, I began hearing frequent noises coming from the attic at night. It was always the same: light footsteps, a soft dragging of something across the floor, and indistinct murmurs. The first few times I heard these sounds, I hesitated to investigate, preferring to believe they were just rats, or perhaps the wind passing through the window cracks. However, the regularity and intensity of the noises increased, and my curiosity soon outweighed my caution. One night, the noises became impossible to ignore. I grabbed a flashlight, trying to be quiet, and climbed the narrow stairs leading to the attic. My heart pounded in my chest as each step creaked under my weight. When I reached the top, the attic door was slightly ajar, and a faint candlelight escaped through the crack. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open slowly, trying to prepare myself for what was to come. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. Zoe was standing in the center of the attic, completely naked, surrounded by lit candles and strange symbols drawn on the floor with chalk. She was murmuring words I couldn't understand, as if she were in a trance. The scene was both fascinating and terrifying, and I was paralyzed for a moment before I could say anything. "Zoe, what are you doing?" My voice trembled slightly, breaking the ritualistic silence. Zoe looked at me, and an enigmatic smile formed on her lips. "Ah, Clara, don't worry. It's just a family tradition," she said calmly, as if what I had just witnessed was the most normal thing in the world. Her eyes gleamed with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. I tried to keep my composure while my heart still hammered in my chest. Even so, Zoe's words didn't reassure me. On the contrary, they only increased my sense of discomfort and doubt about what was really happening in that house. Back in my room, I tried to process what I had seen. Zoe's explanation seemed too simple for something so complex and mysterious. That night, I barely slept, tormented by thoughts of strange rituals and family traditions. The next day, I went to see Emma again and shared what I had witnessed, seeking some kind of guidance. She listened carefully and advised me to be cautious, suggesting that perhaps Zoe was involved in practices that required more than a simple explanation. Her words left me even more alert. One night, after Zoe went upstairs again, I decided I needed to uncover the truth behind her mysterious activities. I grabbed my flashlight and, with hesitant steps, climbed the stairs to the attic. When I reached the top, the scene before me was even more disturbing than the previous one. Zoe was again surrounded by candles, but this time there were more symbols scattered across the floor, and hanging from the ceiling, a crystal swung gently. She murmured words in a language I couldn't identify, completely oblivious to my presence. My heart raced as I watched, feeling a mix of fascination and terror. "Zoe, what are you doing?" I asked again, trying to sound confident. Zoe looked up as if finally noticing my presence. "Clara, you really don't understand," she said, her tone a blend of exasperation and patience. "I'm just following a family tradition. These rituals keep the house safe." Her words hit me like a wave of cold water, but I couldn't feel any security in what she was saying. Every instinct in me screamed for me to leave that place. However, curiosity still held its grip on me. I returned to my room, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. It was difficult to reconcile the image of Zoe, the friendly roommate, with the figure involved in strange rituals in the attic. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with images of candles, symbols, and whispers. The next day, when I saw Zoe in the kitchen, she seemed as normal as ever. But something had changed between us. An invisible barrier had risen, shaped by distrust and fear. As time passed, the situation didn't improve. The rituals continued, and I began to notice subtle changes in the house. Objects were constantly being moved, and Zoe started spreading more and more mystical items throughout the house, even in the bathroom. I felt like an intruder in my own home, where the air was thick with unresolved mysteries. I knew I needed to learn more about Zoe's practices and her true nature, but I still had no idea where to start. The feeling that I was running out of time kept me on constant alert. The following weeks brought a growing unease. Zoe spent more time away, always returning late at night with a calm expression of satisfaction. Meanwhile, inside the house, the feeling of discomfort increased. Objects disappeared mysteriously, reappearing in different places as if they had a life of their own. I was constantly on edge, every sound in the house making me jump. My daily life was being affected, and I knew I needed to act. One morning, while organizing some belongings, I noticed that an old family photo was missing. I searched the entire house, but there was no sign of it. This personal loss was the last straw that made me decide to investigate further and find answers to what was happening. I waited until Zoe left for work and began to search through her belongings, looking for any clues that might explain her rituals. My search was cautious, and I felt every second as a theft of time and privacy. During my investigation, I discovered a collection of occult and esoteric books, filled with information about ancient rituals. I flipped through a few pages, trying to understand what motivated Zoe. The words and images were disturbing, fueling my fear of the unknown. That's when, among the books, I found a spiral-bound journal, carefully hidden under some clothes. I picked it up with trembling hands, knowing I was about to cross an invisible but necessary line. The journal was filled with detailed notes on rituals and spiritual practices, with meticulous descriptions that went far beyond a simple family tradition. One page in particular caught my attention, a plan for purifying the house, where Zoe mentioned the need to rid the space of unwanted presences. Reading these words made my stomach turn. There was no doubt that I was in danger, and I needed to protect myself. That night I sat in the kitchen, waiting for Zoe to return. My heart was heavy with the burden of the information I now carried. When I finally heard the front door open, I prepared myself for the confrontation. Zoe entered, looking carefree, but there was something different in her eyes when she realized I was waiting for her. I knew the moment of truth had come, and whatever was to come, I had to be ready to face it. I stared at Zoe as she entered the kitchen, feeling the tension in the air almost palpable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Zoe looked at me with a slight smile, but her expression changed when she saw the journal in my hands. "What are you doing with that?" she asked, her voice tinged with a dangerous calm. I took a deep breath, trying not to let my fears show. "I know what you're doing, Zoe. Your rituals, your intentions, they're not just family traditions, they're dangerous." Zoe crossed her arms, the friendly facade slowly disappearing. "You really don't understand, do you?" she said, with a hint of exasperation in her voice. "I'm protecting this house and myself. The presence is here. They don't want this place to be a safe home." Her insistence on speaking of things I couldn't see or understand only made me more uneasy. But what really scared me was the mention of unwanted presences. Did she see me as one of them? As Zoe spoke, my mind raced, processing everything I had read in the journal. Every page of that journal detailed plans for purification, outlining rituals aimed at expelling anything that disrupted the balance she believed existed. I didn't know how far Zoe was willing to go to achieve her goal. However, I knew I couldn't allow her obsession to take over and put me in danger. I needed to find a way to resolve this. "Zoe, you need to stop this. There are no presences to purify," I insisted, trying to reach some trace of reason amid her fervent belief. She shook her head, as if my lack of understanding was a disappointment. "Clara, you don't see what I see. I'm doing this for all of us," she replied, the conviction clear in her eyes. I didn't know if I could convince her to stop, but I was determined not to let her rituals affect me any longer. With a heavy sigh, I stood up, still holding the journal. "This needs to stop, Zoe," I declared, my voice firm. "And if it doesn't, I'm leaving. I can't live in a place where I don't feel safe." I hoped my words would have some impact, but the determination in Zoe's eyes left me doubtful. Even so, I needed to distance myself from the growing tension. I knew the situation was far from over, but I also knew I needed to prepare for whatever might happen next. That night, a violent storm descended on Pineville, bringing with it thunder and lightning that illuminated the sky. I was lying in bed, listening to the sound of the wind howling and the trees banging against the windows. My nerves were on edge, every sound amplified by the uncertainty hanging over the house. Suddenly, I heard footsteps above me, heavy and determined, as if someone were walking through the attic. The thought that Zoe was up there again made my heart race. Determined to resolve the situation once and for all, I got up and climbed to the attic. As I opened the door, I saw Zoe surrounded by candles, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her mouth murmuring words I couldn't understand. The scene was surreal and terrifying, but I knew I needed to stop it. "Zoe, please stop this," I shouted, the intensity of my voice cutting through the sound of the storm outside. But she seemed not to hear, immersed in her own world. Desperate, I began to extinguish the candles, trying to break her concentration. Zoe finally looked up, and her eyes were filled with a fury I had never seen before. "You don't understand," she shouted, moving to protect her ritualistic circle. At that moment, I realized how far Zoe was willing to go. The sense of imminent danger was overwhelming, and my survival instinct kicked in. I needed to get out of there fast. I ran for the door, but Zoe blocked my way. "You are the unwanted presence," she said, with a chilling coldness. The shock of her words paralyzed me for a second, but adrenaline gave me the strength to react. I pushed Zoe aside and ran down the hallway, descending the stairs as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard her scream in frustration, but I didn't stop. My hands trembled as I opened the front door and dashed into the storm. Outside, I ran to Emma's house, knowing I needed help. She took me in immediately, and we called the police. I reported everything, from the rituals to the threat Zoe represented. When the police arrived, Zoe was taken for a psychiatric evaluation. The house was finally at peace, but the memories of what I had experienced still haunted me. I decided to move away, leaving the house and its mysteries behind. The experience taught me to trust my instincts more and always to question traditions I don't understand. When Ryan and I moved into our new apartment in the city center, we could hardly contain our excitement. The building had an old-world charm, with its thick walls and large windows that let in a warm, inviting light. The vintage decor, though a bit faded, gave the place a sense of history and character. We were ready to leave our past experiences behind and start a new chapter, believing that this would be the perfect place to do so. However, from the very first day, a subtle sense of unease hung in the air. The building's owner, Mr. Thompson, was a man of few words, but his presence was notably striking. He introduced himself with an enigmatic smile, emphasizing his strict rules for conduct within the building. His sporadic visits were always shrouded in an aura of mystery, his eyes scanning every corner of the apartment. I tried not to dwell too much on it, but the way he spoke about the building's security was peculiar. Yet something told me there was more to his behavior than met the eye. In the first week at the new apartment, I woke up in the middle of the night with a chill down my spine, a feeling that something was terribly wrong. When I opened my eyes, I noticed a figure standing still in the corner of the room. It took me a few seconds to realize it was Ryan, standing completely motionless, sleepwalking and staring intently at the wall as if he were hypnotized. A shiver ran through me when I heard his barely audible murmurs about the eyes that watch. My heart raced, and I could barely breathe. My instincts told me to call out to him, but an inexplicable fear held me back. Was I dreaming? During the day, he seemed more distracted, lost in somber thoughts, but at night was when the transformation truly occurred. I knew something was very wrong, but I hesitated to confront him, afraid of what I might discover. The apartment's atmosphere began to change, becoming more oppressive with each passing day. The creaking floorboards and the wind whistling through the windows created a symphony of unsettling sounds. Even the bright sunlight couldn't dispel the feeling that we were being watched. The sense of security I initially felt was beginning to unravel. As each night passed, my curiosity slowly turned into palpable anxiety. That night, something inside me knew that my fear was about to materialize into something tangible. I fell asleep with a nagging premonition, as if the truth was hidden beneath layers of mystery. The walls seemed to breathe, watching our every move, feeding a silent dread that hung in the air. I realized then that something dark was about to happen, something beyond my darkest expectations. We were about to discover that the safety of our home was an illusion, and that the walls truly had eyes. The nights became a theater of horrors as Ryan began to exhibit more disturbing behavior. I would often find him standing before a specific wall, tearing at the wallpaper with trembling fingers. His eyes, once full of life, were now glazed and vacant, as if he were being consumed by an invisible fear. He whispered about hidden truths and insisted that something or someone was watching us. His words echoed in my mind, planting seeds of doubt. After weeks of growing tension, I decided to investigate on my own, searching for any logical explanation for what was happening. During one of my searches around the apartment, I stumbled upon something small and metallic stuck behind a shelf. It was a tiny camera, strategically placed to capture everything. My heart raced at the thought that perhaps Ryan was right. But who could have put it there? Was it an old installation, or was something more sinister at play? Confronting Ryan about his actions became inevitable, and I needed to understand what was going on. When I finally did, he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by torn pieces of wallpaper, and in a state of evident distress. He looked at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine, and said with frightening conviction that we were being watched. His paranoia was palpable, but there was something in his voice that made me hesitate to dismiss his concerns as delusions. I needed to know the truth. The apartment's atmosphere had become almost suffocating, with every corner seeming to hide secrets waiting to be uncovered. The windows groaned as if they wanted to share confidences, and the shadows danced on the walls, mocking my growing despair. I tried to focus on work, but thoughts of hidden cameras and Ryan's whispers haunted me incessantly. What had once been a safe haven was now a maze of uncertainties. Amidst this chaos, I recalled how Ryan and I had met, the adventures and confidences we had shared. He had always been the more eccentric one, but also the most loyal. Memories of laughter and trust made me question whether I was overlooking something important. With a heavy heart, I decided that I needed to help Ryan, even if it meant confronting my own fears. We were on a path with no return, and I needed to discover where it would lead us. The situation was becoming unbearable, and I knew I needed to understand what was happening in the apartment. I resolved to investigate the building's past, visiting libraries and sifting through old records. What I found was disturbing. Reports from former tenants who also mentioned feeling watched and pursued by unseen eyes. Some even described bizarre behaviors similar to Ryan's. The information was scarce, but the pattern was clear, heightening my unease about what was unfolding there. During one of my searches around the apartment, I discovered something behind a wall that was slightly loose. With a careful tug, a yellowed envelope fell to the floor. Inside it was a letter written by a former tenant, describing experiences of paranoia and mentioning hidden cameras scattered throughout the apartment. The letter spoke of eyes that never blink, the same words Ryan muttered in his sleepwalking episodes. My heart sank as I realized that the problem might be deeper than I had imagined. When I confronted Ryan with these discoveries, he seemed even more convinced that he was right. His state was alarming, and his suspicions now also turned toward me, as if I were part of the scheme. Arguments became frequent, and the fear that hung in the air made the environment even more stifling. He began to isolate himself, spending more time in the company of the mysteries he said he needed to solve. The Ryan I knew seemed to be disappearing, leaving behind only a shadow of his former self. Determined to uncover the truth, I began investigating Mr. Thompson. He seemed to have a pattern of suspicious behavior, controlling the tenants in a way that made me uncomfortable. I questioned the neighbors, who reported strange incidents about their interactions with him, mentioning how he was always around, watching, even without physically showing himself. It was as if he was aware of everything that happened in the building, his rules serving as a smokescreen to hide his true intentions. As I grappled with my doubts, I began to question my own sanity. Was I becoming paranoid too? The cameras, the letter, Mr. Thompson's behavior and Ryan's condition were starting to deeply affect me. Every noise in the apartment made me jump, and every shadow seemed to hide secrets. It was becoming difficult to distinguish between reality and paranoia, and I knew I needed to act before the situation worsened further. With the tension in the apartment reaching its peak, I decided it was time to confront Mr. Thompson directly. I knocked on his door, determined to demand answers about the cameras and the strange occurrences. He opened the door with his usual enigmatic smile, but this time there was a palpable tension in his eyes. When I pressed him, he remained evasive, denying any knowledge of cameras or surveillance schemes. The conversation was frustrating, leaving me with more questions than answers and a growing sense of despair. However, the situation took an unexpected turn when Ryan disappeared. I woke up one morning to find him simply gone, with no note or any indication of where he might have gone. His sudden absence heightened my anxiety, as I knew he was not in his normal mental state. The apartment felt emptier and more oppressive without him, and the sense of being watched intensified. The silence was deafening, and I knew I needed to find him before it was too late. In my search for Ryan, I frantically searched the apartment, looking for any clue to his whereabouts. During this desperate search, I discovered more hidden cameras, each one strategically positioned to monitor our every move. The cameras were a shocking revelation, confirming that we had been under surveillance the entire time. But who was behind it? Ryan's absence and the presence of these cameras created a sense of urgency in me, a drive to solve the mystery once and for all. As I scoured the apartment, I found a secret compartment behind one of the walls. Inside were more letters and personal items left behind by former residents, each detailing experiences of paranoia and persecution. Their words echoed Ryan's, reinforcing the idea that something sinister was indeed happening here. I felt trapped in a cycle of fear and mistrust, unable to escape the clutches of this growing conspiracy. Each discovery brought me one step closer to a frightening truth. With each new detail that emerged, the line between reality and paranoia became increasingly blurred. I was alone, with no one to trust, and the situation seemed hopeless. The pressure was mounting, and I knew I needed to find Ryan and confront whatever was watching us. The apartment, once a home, was now a battleground where every shadow seemed to hide an invisible enemy. I knew the truth was within my reach, but the path to it was becoming more dangerous by the moment. My determination to solve the mystery was at its peak, but the fear inside me grew with every passing moment. With Ryan still missing, I felt adrift in a sea of uncertainties. In a last-ditch effort to understand, I decided to investigate the cameras I had found. I discovered they were part of an old security system, supposedly deactivated years ago. Yet a nagging doubt gnawed at me. Who had reactivated them? And why? The following night was one of the longest of my life. I was determined to stay awake. alert to any suspicious movement in the apartment. As darkness took hold of the room, I began to hear scratching sounds coming from the walls. Each sound seemed louder than the last, reverberating in my chest like a palpable threat. I got out of bed with my heart pounding, armed only with a flashlight and my determination to uncover the truth. I followed the sound to the spot where I had found the secret compartment. To my surprise, there was a new hole in the wall, as if someone had been peeking through from the inside. Trembling with fear, I brought the flashlight closer and, with a quick pull, tore away more pieces of wallpaper. There, I found another camera. This one still active, blinking with a red light that seemed to mock my helplessness. The discovery only deepened my paranoia, confirming that we had been watched all along. I was on the brink of losing my sanity when I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around only to find Ryan standing in the doorway, looking tired and haggard. He had an expression of relief and confusion, as if he had been trapped in a nightmare from which he had finally awakened. My heart calmed at the sight of my friend, but distrust still hung in the air. I asked him where he had been, but his answer was vague and disoriented, as if his memory were foggy. Even so, there was something different about Ryan. He seemed calmer, as if the storm in his mind had finally passed. Yet he couldn't explain his absence or the holes in the wall. The night ended in uneasy silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew I needed answers, but the line between reality and paranoia was becoming increasingly blurred, leaving me with a growing sense of powerlessness. The next day I made an important decision. It was time to leave that apartment and all the darkness that came with it. Before leaving, I resolved to have one last conversation with Mr. Thompson, hoping to finally get some answers. He greeted me with his usual smile, but this time there was something more in his eyes. When I mentioned the cameras and the strange events, he simply shrugged, suggesting that perhaps we were seeing things. His evasive response only fueled my skepticism. Although frustrated, I realized that confronting Mr. Thompson wouldn't get me anywhere. He seemed to know more than he was willing to reveal, but perhaps the truth would never be fully uncovered. As I packed my bags, a thought crossed my mind. What if Ryan's paranoia was only the beginning of something bigger? What if Mr. Thompson was just following orders from something or someone more sinister? The idea was disturbing, but there was no time to find all the answers. Ryan, still disoriented, decided to join me in moving out. He was strangely silent throughout the process, and I could see that he too felt it was the best decision. The apartment, which for a brief moment had been our refuge, was now a memory of fear and uncertainty. As we left, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had gone through similar experiences, and how many more would go through them. As I crossed the threshold for the last time, a sense of relief washed over me, but also a lingering uncertainty. I looked back one last time and saw something that chilled me to the bone. A new camera, freshly installed, blinking with the blue light. I didn't know who was behind the surveillance or what they were really after, but I realized that this chapter in our lives was not completely closed. I knew there might be more mysteries hidden behind the walls, and that we might never fully escape their watchful eyes. As we drove away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story was far from over. The city around us seemed to move on, unaware of the dark secrets hidden behind its ordinary facades. Ryan and I were free, but the uncertainty remained. I knew we had a long way to go to leave it all behind, but also that deep down, the eyes in the walls might never stop watching us. Moving to Chicago seemed like the perfect opportunity for a fresh start. As soon as I stepped into the apartment, I was met with the musty smell of the old walls. I had hoped the apartment would be a refuge, but it exuded a somber atmosphere. Lucy, my new roommate, was waiting at the door with a tense smile. She was small and had eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating. The first thing she told me was to never enter the room next to mine, which was always locked. I found it strange but didn't question it. At first, Lucy seemed like just a reserved person, but the more time I spent with her, the more I noticed her peculiarities. She moved through the apartment like a shadow, almost without making a sound. The silence hung over us like a cloud, making the apartment feel even more unsettling. I tried to break the ice with casual conversations, but her responses were always monosyllabic. Everything was so new to me, and I was trying to adapt to this new reality. I decided to explore the neighborhood, hoping to find something that would make the environment less oppressive. That first night, I was awakened by a strange noise coming from the locked room. Muffled sounds, almost like whispers or faint laughter, seeped through the walls. I rolled over in bed, trying to ignore them, but the mystery of it all began to disturb me. I wondered what could be happening in there. Curiosity began to eat away at me, but at the same time, there was a part of me that didn't want to know the answer. It was as if something was telling me to stay away from that room. As the days passed, curiosity gave way to growing discomfort. I began to notice small details that indicated Lucy had strange habits, like disappearing for hours without warning and returning with bags she never opened in front of me. I wanted to know more about my mysterious roommate, but every attempt to get closer seemed to be blocked by an invisible barrier. There was something about her that made me uneasy. That was when I decided I needed to know more about that room. The next morning, I went to see the building superintendent, an elderly man named James, to try to learn something about Lucy. He seemed to hesitate when I mentioned her name and looked at me with a worried expression. "Some things are better left unknown," he said before quickly walking away. That phrase echoed in my mind, adding another piece to the puzzle my new life was becoming. What was Lucy hiding? I was determined to find out, even if it meant venturing into the unknown. James's words stuck in my head like a sinister melody. I couldn't stop thinking about what he meant by, "Some things are better left unknown." In the following days, I kept trying to break the distance between me and Lucy, but it was like trying to climb an invisible wall. The apartment, with its dark hallways and small windows, began to feel increasingly claustrophobic. I decided to explore the building, hoping to find answers or at least some distraction. As I explored the building, I began to meet other residents. They were friendly at first, but any mention of Lucy or the locked room completely changed their expressions. An elderly man on the third floor, upon hearing her name, simply shook his head and went back into his apartment without saying a word. Each interaction left me more confused, as if everyone was keeping a secret. The heavy atmosphere of the building seemed to envelop all of us in a veil of silence and mystery. I wondered what could be so terrible that everyone avoided talking about it. Despite all the subtle warnings, curiosity continued to gnaw at me. One night, while Lucy was out, I decided to try looking through the keyhole of the locked room. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding. As I bent down to peek, I saw only shadows dancing on the walls. A shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the other side. I felt an invisible hand touch my shoulder, and I quickly backed away. The next day, I decided to confront Lucy about what I had seen, or felt. I chose my words carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. However, her reaction was more disturbing than I expected. She stared at me, her eyes unblinking for a moment before she whispered, "Some doors should never be opened." Her cold and calculated tone sent chills down my spine. I wondered what she meant by that. It was clear that my presence and questions were beginning to bother her. As the days went by, the tension between us grew. I could feel that Lucy knew I was suspicious, and she became even more reserved. The fragile relationship we had was on the verge of breaking. I knew I needed to be careful, but the urgency to uncover the truth grew stronger with each passing day. Every noise, every shadow seemed to whisper a warning, but ignoring them was no longer an option. The mystery of the locked room was pulling me deeper, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist before giving in. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. Every night, the apartment seemed to come alive, as if whispers were echoing through the walls. One early morning, after being awakened once again by strange sounds, I decided to search through Lucy's trash for clues. Among crumpled papers and empty boxes, I found a small doll with incredibly detailed features and a name tag, Sarah 2019. The discovery sent a chill down my spine, and I began to question what Lucy really did in her free time. The next morning, I waited for Lucy to leave so I could investigate further. Rummaging through the kitchen, I found a notebook hidden in a drawer, full of names and dates, like a record of something I still didn't understand. The name of the missing tenant was there, underlined in red, along with other indecipherable notes. My heart raced at the thought that I might be living with someone involved in something sinister. My mind buzzed with theories, each one more terrifying than the last. As the days passed, my discomfort grew. The apartment, which had once been just an unfamiliar place, now felt like a prison. Every time Lucy came home, my tension increased. I tried to confront her again about what I had found, but her answers were always vague and uninterested. "You shouldn't worry about that, Emma," she said once, giving me a cold, distant look. It was clear that she knew I had been snooping through her things, but she didn't seem to care, or maybe she knew I had no concrete proof. The feeling of helplessness consumed me. My nights were filled with strange dreams, with formless shadows and wide-eyed dolls. Every noise in the building seemed amplified, as if it were warning me of something I still couldn't understand. I began to doubt my own sanity, questioning if it was all just paranoia. However, the evidence I had found suggested that something was deeply wrong, something I needed to uncover before it was too late. Determined not to let fear control me, I went back to speak with James, the superintendent. He hesitated once more when I mentioned Lucy, but after much persistence, he finally gave me a grim warning. "This building has seen many things," he said, his gaze full of meaning. "You need to be careful, Emma. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than it seems." His words only strengthened my resolve. I was willing to take the risk, even if it meant facing the consequences alone. I was at home reading a book when Lucy announced she would be out for a few hours. As soon as I heard the door close, I got up and walked to the locked room. With trembling hands, I turned the knob, and to my surprise, the door opened. I entered the room and was immediately greeted by dozens of porcelain dolls arranged on shelves, each with a name and year on a tag. The air was heavy and smelled of dust, as if time had stopped there. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the doll with the missing tenant's name. As I examined the room, an empty shelf caught my attention. I looked closer and saw something that made my skin crawl. My own photo attached to the shelf, as if marked for a future doll. The gravity of the situation hit me hard, and I realized that Lucy had terrible intentions. I looked around, hoping to find something that could explain the situation, but all I felt was a growing fear of being there. I wanted to leave, but curiosity was still strong, holding me in place. The collection of dolls was a disturbing sight, but there was something more in that room. In the corner, an old desk with scattered papers caught my attention. Among the documents, I found drawings of dolls, detailed notes about each tenant, and plans on how to keep them happy. The words "keep them happy" were written repeatedly, like an obsessive mantra. The obvious conclusion was that Lucy believed she was performing some kind of ritual, something I couldn't fully understand, but that certainly included me as part of it. I left the room with my heart racing, trying to process everything I had discovered. The feeling of being watched had never been more intense than at that moment. I knew I needed to act, but the fear of how Lucy would react paralyzed me. However, my safety was at stake, and I could no longer delay. I had to confront Lucy, understand her intentions, and find a way to escape before something worse happened. I needed to find the strength within myself to face the situation, regardless of the consequences. When Lucy finally returned, my fear was mixed with determination. I waited for the right moment and confronted her directly about the room. Lucy smiled, a smile that was anything but friendly. "They need to be happy, Emma," she said calmly, as if her logic was unquestionable. The words came out of her mouth with a serenity that alarmed me even more. "You need to be happy too." That was the moment I realized the gravity of the situation. I needed to find a way out of there, and fast. The following days were a mix of terror and planning. The expression on Lucy's face when she said I needed to be happy wouldn't leave my mind. Every time she left, I searched for new clues and tried to figure out a way to escape that nightmare. I found an old screwdriver and decided to keep it as an improvised weapon. The feeling of being constantly on the brink of imminent danger only increased my determination. I knew I needed to be careful and clever to survive. One night, after a particularly tense day, I gathered the courage to speak with James again. I found him in the hallway, and he seemed even more worried than before. "You found something, didn't you?" he asked in a whisper. I nodded and described the dolls on the shelf with my photo. James looked around as if fearing someone might hear us. "Lucy isn't the first to live here with that locked room," he revealed. "The dolls, the shelves, all of it was here before her." James's revelation was a shock. It meant that the cycle of terror had been going on for a long time, and Lucy was just the latest piece of a dark puzzle. I asked him if there was any way to stop it. "The only thing that can break the cycle is to destroy the dolls," he said. The idea of confronting Lucy and destroying her precious dolls was terrifying, but it seemed to be the only solution. I thanked James for his help and returned to the apartment with a new plan. I waited until Lucy went out again to put my plan into action. I entered the locked room with the screwdriver in hand, ready to destroy the dolls. Each strike against the porcelain felt like a step toward my freedom. The sound of the dolls breaking echoed through the room, creating a sinister cacophony. I knew there was no turning back. As the fragments scattered across the floor, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with fear. I was breaking the cycle, but at what cost? When Lucy returned, she immediately realized what I had done. Her face twisted in fury and pain. "You don't understand what you've done," she screamed, lunging at me. I held the screwdriver tightly, ready to defend myself. The struggle that followed was brutal and desperate. Lucy was determined to stop me from destroying her world, but my determination was greater. I managed to knock her down and flee the room, locking the door behind me. My heart pounded uncontrollably as I prepared for the next stage of the confrontation. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside the apartment. I knew I needed to act quickly before Lucy could open the locked door. I ran to the phone and called the police, frantically describing the situation. As I waited, I heard Lucy pounding on the door, screaming and promising that I would pay for what I had done. Every second felt like an eternity. Lucy's presence on the other side of the door was like a sinister shadow, threatening to engulf me at any moment. When the police finally arrived, the sounds of pounding and shouting abruptly stopped. The officers broke down the door to the locked room, finding Lucy sitting on the floor, surrounded by the broken pieces of the dolls. Her empty, desperate gaze was disturbing. "You don't understand, they need to be happy," she kept repeating as she was taken away by the police. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Lucy was out of the picture, but the feeling of danger hadn't completely disappeared. The police searched the apartment, but the evidence of the broken dolls and Lucy's behavior was enough to take her into custody. As the officers led her away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. However, the sense that something more was to come remained. The mystery of the locked room wasn't completely resolved. There were too many unexplained aspects that left me uneasy. I decided that I needed to leave that place, to leave everything behind and start anew. The following days were a blur of activity as I scrambled to find a new place to live. I spoke with James one last time before leaving. "You did what you had to do," he said, giving me a sympathetic look. "I hope you find peace wherever you go." His words were comforting, but I knew the scars from that apartment would stay with me for a long time. I left the building with my bags, leaving behind a dark chapter of my life. But what I found at the exit put me on alert. As I walked away from the building, I saw a young woman moving into the apartment I had just left. She looked as excited as I had been when I arrived. I looked up and saw the door to the locked room closed again. The cycle could start anew, I thought, and I felt a chill. I didn't know what the future held for that young woman, but I hoped she had better luck than I did. I walked toward my new destination, determined to leave the horrors of the past behind, but knowing that some doors once opened can never truly be closed.